My name is Ashley, and this is Let's Talk Dispatch.
I do. You're gonna do it. Do it really well.
And I believe the world needs more dispatchers.
Around in the mud, blood, and beer.
Years that I'm not working 4th of July. 4th of July.
Say community policing, right? What about community dispatching?
So on this show, with the help of my guests, we will educate, empower, and support the heroes behind the headset. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode here at Let's Talk Dispatch with me, Ashley, the Raspy Dispatcher. I just got off of doing a little live on my Instagram. So I randomly did that last week. I just jumped on live while I was editing some content. And it was really fun. Lots of folks asking questions, lots of folks commenting. So I thought, why don't I just do that again? So I'll probably be doing that every other week or so, just jumping on for like 30 minutes to an hour just to chat with you folks, connect with you in our little virtual community that we have built. So if you don't follow us on Instagram, definitely make sure to do so at the Raspy Dispatcher. And so you can check out those lives and, of course, ask any questions in my DMs or on our comments. We're pretty active across our social media platforms. So, but that's just a fun thing that we've started doing that I wanted to share with everybody, just in case you don't follow us on Instagram. So for today's episode, I'm extremely excited to get going because me and my guests have been trying to make this happen for it feels like months. So I'm so excited to finally be able to have them on. My guest today is a therapist who previously worked for the FBI as a civilian, and which helped create her passion for mental health for first responders and civilians in law enforcement. They created the company Beyond the Storm Behavioral Health. My guest today, Rachel.
Hello. Hi.
How
You're right.
are you?
It's been some months.
I know, like we were supposed to link up last week. I wasn't feeling well. You had to reschedule early. So we've been battling this storm to get this.
Yes,
To
right.
get this on the book. So I'm
Yes.
super excited. Your history, your career, your journey is so interesting. And I'm excited to hear more about it today.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm so honored to have the opportunity to chat with you and finally meet you since we've been emailing for months. But I love an opportunity to talk about mental health for first responders and just really continue, reducing the stigma and reaching out for help, because we have just been so bad at that as first responders, really until recently when we realized, like, man, we're not doing things right and we're not taking good care of ourselves.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about your journey in public safety and how you got involved with that.
Great. So I worked crimes against children for 17 years. So the first 6.5, I worked at a child advocacy center as a forensic interviewer down in Southwest Missouri. And then in 2012, I moved back to Kansas City, which is where I grew up, for a forensic interviewer position with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So I was there until January of last year and had a position that was fabulous, but I did have quite a bit of travel and decided that I wanted to be closer to home and spend more time with my family and also have a break from crimes against children, because 17 years had been a long time. So while I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, I wanted to make sure that I still was doing something that was really meaningful and giving back to the community. And that's where I decided that I wanted to reopen my clinical practice that I had closed whenever I joined the Bureau and open it in Kansas City versus Southwest Missouri and really focus on first responder mental health. And so we began that journey about 15 months ago, and it was just me. And now I have 7 clinicians in the practice. And so it's grown exponentially and been a really big honor to walk alongside firefighters, dispatchers, law enforcement during their mental health journeys and just helping them see that hope on the other side.
It's so amazing. I mean, we talk about the trauma that we're exposed to as first responders in this line of work in general. And I think for everybody, everyone's triggers, of course, are different. But I think when you talk about crimes against children and the realities of that line of work and the things you're exposed to, being able to say you've done it for 17 years, I mean, that is a feat, I would say,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
itself, the fact that you committed to that for so long. And so what was, that like working for the FBI? I personally love the alphabet crew. I love the idea of, FBI,
Yeah.
but what
Yeah.
was that like in that role as a forensic interviewer?
Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, it was my dream. So just to get an interview for the position was like heaven to me because I couldn't believe that the FBI would consider me to
Mhm.
work for them. And then lo and behold, I was offered the position and was really able to do just amazing work. There are so many amazing people that work for the FBI, and I was able to work cases all over the world. And that was something that I would not have been able to do had I stayed local. So it was such an honor. And I did work crimes against children prior to becoming a mom and after. And so I did definitely notice a shift in what the experience was like and what that trauma exposure was like after becoming a mom to a little girl versus doing it before and still being in disbelief about the things that children go through. But then when you become that parent, you can start seeing things differently and just thinking about, man, what would I do if something like this happened to my child? And so it was a little harder to not personalize, some of what you see. But one thing that I've learned in working with my first responders is when we even shift our language a little bit and say, what is the impact that your job has had on you? I think that resonates with people because I think sometimes trauma has a negative connotation,
Mhm.
but I would argue that working crimes against children, I don't believe that it caused me trauma, but I do believe it impacted me and the way I parent and the way that I view the world. And so I think that's one thing that when I was working with the FBI and partnering with a lot of our local agencies, I really, when I knew I was going to get back to the mental health side, I just wanted to be able to say, hey, I've been there. I've seen some of the same things you've seen, and I get it. And I want you to know that you can live life without having it be something that negatively impacts you day in and day out.
Mhm. I love that. I love when we take language and shift because now, like forever, you just glass ceiling broken. Now I'll forever like use that
Mhm.
language to talk about trauma in our line of work and like because it is true, like language does affect the way that we interact with the world. And I think what we can get into a cycle in the first responder world, especially between like dispatch and patrol and like figuring out how we fit
Excuse me.
is just this reality like we all experience these things and the way I experience it looks different than the way my patrol officer experiences it,
Sure.
my detective experiences it, and we're not trying to get into a situation where we're balancing like mine is heavier than yours or yours is heavier than mine. It's like we're just all experiencing it differently. And it's all relative to the work we do.
Absolutely. And that's why I felt like I had a really unique perspective being a civilian in a law enforcement agency for that
Mhm.
reason. Because
Mhm.
while I wasn't a sworn FBI agent, I was still boots on the ground. And so I worked the Boston bombing, I worked the Highland Park parade shooting, I would work child abduction cases, I would help support search warrants. Now, again, I wasn't the one ramming the door. And so I'm not, trying to take away from the work that law enforcement did, but we needed each other. And it was that collaboration. And many of my agents would say things like, I could never sit in that room and talk to kids about that stuff the way you do. I can talk to the perps, but I can't talk to the kids. And I'm like, and that's why we're a good team. So that's one thing that I've also been trying to really message out with my mental health outreach is while I do focus on first responder mental health, to me, when we talk about dispatch or other civilians in law enforcement agencies, they encompass that category as well. And so I'm really passionate about sworn mental health, but also civilian mental health, because I think that has slipped through the cracks for years because we have put people in kind of these pockets. And so I really like that we have people that we're able to say, these individuals also have things that they're exposed to that are impactful, and we need to hold space for that too.
I love that because I think, for a very long time, dispatchers felt like they were those people. We
Hmm.
were and we were part of the team. We were dealing with these things, and we weren't being acknowledged. We weren't receiving services. We weren't being
Right.
part of these debriefs. And I do think there are other facets of the department and these agencies that, like you said, do slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
I even just like CSI or like, I don't know what
Mhm.
services those folks have access to or getting, but
Right.
everyone who is a part of this process, whether it be, taking the call, responding out to the scene, interviewing on the back end, we're all being impacted by the things we're hearing, seeing,
Right.
smelling, touching, and all that matters and affects our mental health.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Well, tell us about Beyond the Storm Behavioral Health and
Yes.
what this revamping, this rebirth, this is
Yes.
doing.
Yeah, yes. So I opened a private practice last January. So, of course, I took 0 time off. I left the FBI on a Friday and started on a Monday, which I highly don't advise. Like, take a minute, please. But, here we are. But I opened the practice with the intention of focusing on mental health for trauma survivors and also first responders. What's been really neat is in Missouri, we have a statutory mandate that all sworn law enforcement have to have a mental health check-in with a clinician. The language is a bit loose, but it's about every 3 to 5 years. But the good news is that most departments around the Kansas City metro are actually doing them yearly or every other year.
Mm.
And so that's been a really neat opportunity to partner with different law enforcement agencies and soon to be fire agencies, so we can start doing more proactive outreach about mental health. And so every single person that is a sworn law enforcement officer has to come meet with a clinician. And the good news is that that helps reduce the stigma. And so being able to have conversations, provide resources, referrals, and no one knows if someone's coming in to talk about something really impactful or just talking about pleasantries. And so it takes away some of the worry that your colleagues are going to know that you're talking to a counselor, because everyone has to.
Yeah.
So that's been a really big focus of my clinical work. But I also have 4 other clinicians and 2 interns that are also providing services for a variety of individuals. So we see individuals, couples, families, children, adolescents, adults, and I really like being able to bridge the gap with mental health services, particularly because we take insurance, and that's something that just helps increase access. So that's been a really fun journey. And I've kind of expanded a bit over time and am starting to do more training and continuing expert testimony work. So I really like to have a few different things going on, so I don't, get burned out or feel like I'm, just doing kind of one thing and staying stagnant. So I really like that I've been able to be self-employed and grow things the way that I envision. So it's been a really good journey.
No, it sounds like it's doing so well, and you're kind of diving back into something that you were doing before with kind of a new lens and new
Yeah.
experience. One thing that I think is interesting, at least specifically with like dispatchers and dealing with folks telling their stories, is finding a way to get my caller to tell their story, tell me the thing that they're reporting without with the least amount of harm, right? Because
Hmm.
I need to know why you're calling. It's one of
Right.
the things where I have to prod a little bit. Um, but how do we have those conversations with causing the least amount of harm?
So I think a lot of it is staying calm yourself. So I think that that is something that, if we become dysregulated or try to hurry someone or even make someone feel invalidated in
Mhm.
sharing what's going on with them, that can go a long way. So keeping your cool and trying to help the caller understand, I know, sir, that, there's a lot going on, but I want to make sure we can get you the right help. And so, as calmly as possible, can you walk me through what's going on, and just kind of helping them de-escalate, because sometimes what can happen is when a caller gets louder, you may feel the need to get louder, and we start kind of matching some of those interactions. So really kind of meeting people where they're at and recognizing that this could be the worst moment of their lives, and you are their only hope in some situations. And so being able to stay calm, cool, and collected and keep them focused, and being able to say, hey, I understand that this is really scary, but it's going to help us get someone sooner and just kind of help explain that process, because I think sometimes people can feel cut off and invalidated if they don't know why we're shifting that focus. And I do similar things in counseling. If have someone that continues to kind of go off course, I'll say like, hey, I want to make sure we stay in alignment with your treatment plan. So let's kind of circle back around to here. So really providing that guidance, but maybe as much of an explanation as you have time to give, knowing that you're on borrowed time, but just being able to say, hey, we want to get you some help. Help me understand, where's the address, or tell me what's going on. Let's take a breath, and just trying to get them to regulate so they can give you what you need so you can get the right help, because those minutes matter.
No, they really do. And I think the conversation around, mental health, self-care for first responders is definitely getting better, right? We're talking about it more. We're acknowledging that it exists. Everything we've swept under the rug, we're actually lifting up and we're taking it out and talking about it.
Right.
But for those who are listening and they're like, Ashley, Rachel, you guys are tripping. I don't want to go talk to nobody about nothing. I'm fine.
Right.
What would you say to that person who maybe feels like they don't need to talk to someone, or that like the call they took isn't that big, or the incident they dealt with, someone else dealt with something worse? What would you say to that person?
Well, first of all, that is such a common theme with our first responders is we trauma compare. And so we try to say that someone else is more deserving to get help than we are, or someone else had it worse or was exposed to worse. And the reality is that trauma is an incident. It's something that happens, but the way that we process it and internalize it is what makes it traumatic or impactful on us or not. So, you and I could go through the same incident and one of us could be more greatly impacted than the other. And there's a variety of reasons why that can be. Some of it can be just personal characteristics, or maybe it's your 10th critical incident in 2 years. And that's why this one, strikes you a little bit differently. But I want to ensure that people are being honest with themselves about if things are really impacting them or not, because that's one thing that I'm hearing a lot about is people have gotten so good at compartmentalizing things that they don't even recognize the impact that these things have on them. We know that first responders see anywhere between 500 and 800 critical incidents in their lifetime, as compared to civilians that see maybe 1 to 3. So it is rampant. And so it's not a matter of when or if, it's when you're going to see these critical incidents. And so 2 things I would say as kind of like, if the only thing that you hear me say today, one is that you don't have to wait until you're flatlining to reach out for mental health support. In fact, we prefer if you reach out a little sooner, because it's a little bit easier to provide you with resources when you're not at the end of your rope. That doesn't mean it's too late if you're at the end of your rope. But I think we've gotten this misconception that if you're going to work every day and you're kicking ass at your job and you're showing up, that you don't have anything that could use assistance. But the reality is that a lot of people can be experiencing a lot of trauma and also still be really good at their jobs and still be showing up for their kids and still be good spouses, but maybe they're suffering with a lack of sleep or feeling good or having physical health issues. So I would say not waiting until the bitter end and actually taking care of yourself, knowing that that will make you a better first responder and friend and spouse and parent. The other piece is that we are just as human as we are first responders. And so there's no expectation, unless you put it on yourself, that you would be exposed to the things you are and that you should be able to handle it without assistance. It's been this misconception for years that you could go to a gnarly scene and then just pretend it didn't happen. And that's just not the way the brain works. So if we know biologically the way that we are made and wired, we recognize that we're fooling ourselves when we try to say that we're going to go to these incredibly difficult scenes and just pretend it didn't happen or try to forget about it. So I'd say be honest with yourself and know that there are culturally competent clinicians that work with first responders that get it. And even if you've been in counseling before and it didn't go well, you didn't have a good experience, it doesn't mean counseling didn't work. It just may not have been the right fit.
And I think that last part too is so important for people to hear, because I've talked to people who have said like, I've done counseling, it didn't work for me. And, counseling and therapy, it's very much like the latest dating app out there. You got to swipe until you
Yep.
find the right fit. Not
Yep.
every counselor, therapist is going to be the right fit for you.
Right.
The vibe might be right. And,
Right.
the type of therapy, there's so many different types of therapy now
Yep.
that are working for folks. So it really is about finding the right fit for you and what works for you.
Right. And that's it, because the metaphor I use is like, if you go get a bad haircut somewhere, you don't just stop going to see a hairstylist. You just don't go back to that hairstylist. And so trying it out, and even trying it at different phases in life, because maybe counseling didn't work 5 years ago for you because you weren't ready. So I don't always want to blame the clinician, because sometimes if you didn't have that motivation to change or weren't ready to be honest, that's why it wasn't helpful. But we also know that having the right fit, having the right skill set, having the right personality connection makes a difference too. And there are so many organizations nationwide that vet counselors that want to work with first responders to ensure that there's some sort of cultural competence, whether that's because they were first responders or have special training, or have an interest in the population and they seek that continuing education. So I just don't want people to give up or even feel like they're hopeless, because when you get the right fit, it's amazing, the transformation. And sometimes I think people don't realize how much they're struggling until they aren't anymore, because it's become so normalized. And so when you think about, how you feel, how's your sleep, how's your stress level, if you're honest with yourself and they feel overwhelming and out of control, there are ways to get out of that. And even if it's 35 years of first responder career that you're dealing with, it's still not too late. So that's the other thing. I don't want some of our seasoned folks that feel like they have so much stuff to unpack, like, where do I begin? We can help with that. I have several clients right now that are towards the end of their career, and we've got a lot to unpack, but we're going to get there. And so it's, it really is for everyone.
It is. And it's for everyone at any point of their career. When, I think I had one person, a dispatcher, come onto the show, and their advice to the dispatcher was like, get a therapist day one, don't wait for the thing to be so traumatic, so heavy, so, one thing after another, to, like you said, where you're feeling like you're flatlining, to ask for help. Because it can be, I think in our line of work, we're very responsive. A thing happens, you call us, we come out,
Right.
A lot of times our callers want to know how we prevent the thing from happening. And a lot of those things we can't prevent, like the crime has to be committed for our units to have any type of ability to do XYZ. So we end up dealing with a lot of victims, a lot of survivors, and for this type of situation, we can be a little more preventative. We can get help before the thing, happens greatly that impacts us, which I think is something great about, therapy and companies like yourself are offering us.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. When we can be proactive versus reactive, that is the goal. I tell people, like, I'm a therapist and I have a therapist, and not because I'm flatlining, but because I'm trying to stay in a healthy way so I can show up for my clients. And at any point when you're a first responder, it could be the worst call of your career and you just don't know it. We actually had an officer involved shooting about a month ago, and the officer was killed in the line of duty. And it was greatly impactful for that agency and several agencies around here. And I think it has really shaken people up, because it was a type of call that you would normally not be so worried about. There's certain calls, what you're walking into, but this was a routine call that should not have turned out the way that it did. And I think for a lot of people, they recognize their mortality. And so I'm happy that several people that were directly involved either already had a clinician or very quickly reached out to one after the incident, because I think that's a big shift, because people usually wait for things to fester and get worse. And I'm really happy to see that people are starting to be proactive to say, this was really messed up and I want to deal with it now. So this isn't one more thing in the suitcase of trauma that I have to drag along with me.
No, it's true. I remember when I first started at my first agency, that was one of the things that they said often. They were like, we haven't had an OIS in over 25, 30 years. And then that following year, we had one and we lost our officer. And as a new dispatcher, you don't realize, even like at my agency, it was so big. I never got to meet this officer. We had multiple substations, but the impact was still like so heavy. So I could only imagine now at the agency that I currently work at. I know all of these officers, whereas so the level of intimacy that is felt when something goes wrong, even when it's just officers getting into a physical fight, there's a different level of feeling that goes into like worst case scenarios, and having to unpack those things is challenging, and it is something we should have a plan for before we need a plan.
Right. Because trying to plan when the crisis is happening, we know doesn't work, and it's disorganized and isn't effective. And so having those crises planned, having peer support, having a plan for debriefing, all of those things, we hope we don't need it, but we know we likely will. And so that's why partnering with clinicians that that get it, that will be available, that can do the things that you need in those moments, I think is really important too. So I always like to talk about that piece. So if there are supervisors or other people that are trying to look at ways to support their folks, it is that proactive nature and partnering with those clinicians and personnel that can be available. So you don't have to vet somebody in the crisis. Hey, I can call Rachel and we'll get her on board because we've already had a relationship with her. So it does help.
That's amazing. And so you've been on the civilian side of things, but you've been heavily involved with law enforcement, the FBI, interviewing survivors. And do you think, when you look back at all the years that you've been doing this, do you visually see the shift in regards to mental health and just how different it is now compared to then, like with peer support being a thing and all these conversations being had? What can you say about that shift that you've witnessed over your career?
Absolutely. So absolutely, because I really started working with victims of crimes back in like 2000, really. So over 20 years, nearly 25, that I've been kind of, that kind of in the field in some way. And so at that time, it really was suck it up buttercup mentality. It was like, hey, you know what you signed up for, you got to find a way to cope. And there wasn't space to necessarily say that something impacted you. Or if you did, you kind of had to hide and, kind of go cry in your office and then pull it together and then go on to the next thing. And so I really have seen a shift, of course, from the beginning of my career, but I would even say in the last 5 to 10 years, I've really noticed a shift in the right direction. And we still have a ways to go, but just the fact that we're having conversations about mental health and that we are having folks, stand up and say, hey, I wish I would have handled things differently. And I want the younger generation who is just getting started to know the pitfalls of not dealing with mental health, I think is really, really valuable. So there's been a huge shift in my career, but truly, even in just the last 5 to 10 years, just being able to have this open dialogue and have people reach out for support and talk about their journeys and talk about suicide, I think has been so valuable, because we've had this worry like, oh, if we say the word suicide, somebody might, suicide, or we may plant the idea, and that is not true. And so being able to, I say name it to tame it. So we have to say that we have increased suicide risk with first responders. We have increased mental health issues because of that exposure. And so just the fact that we quantify it, knowing that we're, definitely missing the boat because not everything gets reported and there's, different data concerns. However, just being able to say that it is an option to remove that stigma and do things differently than we always have. I think that's such an important acknowledgement for people that are newer to the field. So they're not feeling like, man, I don't want to be like so-and-so who's getting ready to retire and looks miserable or has lost everything. Knowing that there are things you can put in place to actually have a really successful and healthy career and maintain what's important to you.
It's true. And I mean, we talk about, suicide in the field a lot when it comes to our officers, and there is an uptick in dispatchers as well, that gets missed a lot. And I think what these realities are telling us is that for so long, we haven't been creating a safe space for people to feel their feelings. And hopefully this shift is really going to show those numbers, hopefully decreasing over the X amount of years, because like you said, you have folks who are seasoned in this line of work starting to come in and unpack stuff from 20, 30 years ago, and if we're creating environments in our centers, in our departments, where we're not just creating policy to say that we have the policy, but we're actually creating a culture where this is okay and it's accepted, then we're gonna see those numbers decrease. And hopefully that is the direction we're heading.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's an important consideration when you're thinking about wellness programs at your agency. You don't want it to feel like to your employees that you're checking a box. You want to have that investment and show that the intention is for people to take better care of themselves so they have better work-life balance and fewer mental health issues, which from an agency perspective increases longevity and retention. And so it really does make sense as an investment to invest in your people's mental health and wellness, because ultimately it keeps people healthier and happier longer. So we don't want people to feel like, oh, this isn't a value here, we're just doing it so we can say we're doing it. We want there to be truly a collaboration, whatever that looks like for your agency. So you have the steps in place for, of course, crises, but also day-to-day stuff, someone going through a personal matter. We try so hard to say, oh, I leave work at work and I leave home at home, but that's impossible because you're the common denominator and you're going to both places. So we can try all day long, but those things bleed a little bit. And so that's something that we want to hold space for, that getting support is not just for work stuff, although that's very important because the personal stuff can be, just as impactful as well.
So for someone who's listening and they're going, Ashley, Rachel, you convinced me. This stuff sounds wonderful. What would be, obviously it differs between states and places and all that good stuff, but what would kind of be the first place for someone to kind of start that journey in figuring out what works best for them?
Sure. And you're exactly right. It is very dependent on your agencies, but for many of your agencies, you probably have a peer support team or employee assistance program that you can, at least lean into initially and find out what your resources are. Employee assistance programs can be great because they are at no cost to the employee. So that's a way to get your foot in the door with a clinician and try to have access to services and resources and referrals. If you go to those entities and you don't, you hit a roadblock or you're not getting the support that you need, there are agencies usually in each state that kind of oversee first responder mental health. I'm in Missouri, and so we have a first responder provider network over on the Missouri side and First Midwest on the Kansas side that oversees peer support and training. And so in my states, we have a list of clinicians on those sites that have been vetted as culturally competent. Let's say, though, that you have explored all of these options and they just don't exist in your area. You can also go on somewhere like Psychology Today and do a search for someone who indicates that they work with first responders. And then I encourage people to be picky. And so ask for a 15-minute consultation, ask questions, what is your experience in working with first responders? Because it's different to be pro police than experienced with first responders. So I want someone to give examples of, hey, I used to work for a law enforcement agency, or I'm prior law enforcement, or my spouse is law enforcement, or I've spent time with my first responder agencies. I've sat in dispatch, I've done ride-alongs. And so you can ask some of those questions. And if a person isn't able to answer those things, then there's your answer, and you can move on to the next person. So the other piece is just kind of networking. I know that I will often talk with people, and if I don't have the capability of getting them in, I will do a soft handoff to a clinician that I trust. And so that's a nice other thing about having kind of a point of contact. That way somebody doesn't have to cold call. I can say, hey, I'm full, but I have someone in my agency or someone that I trust that I refer to. So there are tons of Facebook groups, social media groups with different practice information. So it's really kind of familiarizing yourself with what you have in your area, but also knowing that nationwide there are some agencies as well that kind of vet people all over the country.
That's awesome. So I wouldn't even have thought to think that there was probably a network, and it's probably across the state. So I definitely encourage folks who are listening to do that research, because someone's probably already done the research for you and has it there for us to be able to easily access it. And I think one thing that stood out for me in your advice was ask the questions, like be the person asking the questions of this other individual to make sure that it's a good fit. It's something I tell aspiring dispatchers in the interview process. It's like, they're going to ask you questions, sure, but it's also extremely important that you figure out if this is a good fit, because all departments aren't equal. I would say all therapists are not equal. And that's not saying one's good or bad. It just might not be the right fit for you. So the part of asking questions yourself throughout life, all of your experiences, is super important, just because you're the one who needs the value.
Absolutely. And if you're listening and you're a clinician and you're like, man, I want to work with first responders, but I don't know where to get started. A colleague of mine and I just actually started the First Responder Behavioral Health Network, and we are going to be working on training clinicians who want to work alongside first responders. So it is a new business venture, only a couple of weeks old, but we've got a Facebook page you're welcome to follow for information. But I do think there are people that want to be able to help first responders, but maybe don't know where to get started and start networking and building. And so there are resources out there similar to what my colleague and I created, I know already existing across the country. And so kind of seeking that out, if you're on the helping side and you're like, man, I would really love to support these agencies, but I don't know where to get started, check out those type of entities so you can look at trainings that help you become more competent to deal with these different populations.
That's awesome. It's such a cool business venture, I would say, because it's true. We're first responders are kind of a tough nut to crack. Is that the same? Because if you're not in it, we're a little harder to trust you, to get in there with you. So the fact that you folks are offering a way for people to learn and get into this niche that needs all the help we can get is wonderful. I think that's such a cool thing you guys are doing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it can be a tough crowd, right? And so being able to get some of that buy-in and know that once you do get your foot in the door, you can really do some amazing things. So it's it's so rewarding. And I'm so happy that when I made that decision to walk away from the FBI, then I've been able to do something that still feels like I'm really giving back to the community and helping people who, help others. So it's been neat to identify, training deficits or different things that we can do differently and be able to have some ideas on how to fill some of those gaps.
Awesome. So we've been, talking about mental health, self-care, and all those things. And what is one big takeaway people should understand about the importance of it all in regards to first responders and mental health?
Absolutely. So, self-care again has gotten a bad rap over the years because people think that means like bubble baths and chocolates and massages. And while that can be some of it, I read something earlier this week that said real self-care is not creating a life that we want to avoid. And that really resonated with me because I feel like we have put self-care in this category of it's for someone who's weak or someone who can't handle what they signed up for. And the reality is that society now expects us to exceed our expectations. So we have to be available 24/7 and we can never be sick and we always have to show up and there's no room for you. And we've perpetuated this by not setting boundaries and not taking care of ourselves. And so that's what I would say when we think about self-care. It's what you do to pour back in yourself. So it doesn't have to be, long walks on the beach and bubble baths and a glass of wine. What we want it to be is whatever is restorative for you when you turn off whatever is sucking the life out of you. And so sometimes people will push back and be like, well, I need to always be available and I'm on call. And I get that. When I was with the FBI, we were a responsive unit. And so did I sometimes get called after hours? Yes. But did I get called every single day after hours? No. And you're not the only one at your agency. And so sometimes setting boundaries and being able to say to yourself, like, what would it look like to set my phone down for 15 minutes and really just focus on my family? Or maybe turn my phone off or tell someone, hey, I'm not going to be reachable via email, but if you need me in an urgent situation, call me. Because I think we have perpetuated this need to be available all the time. And so we imply that we don't have time for self-care. And so when someone comes into my office and says, I don't have time to take care of myself, first thing I ask them to do is look at their screen time usage. And we find a lot of wasted time on screen time, right? And so I say, what would it look like instead of being on Instagram for 5 hours this week if we poured into ourselves differently instead of that mindless scrolling? So we make time for what we prioritize, and just knowing that self-care means doing something that gives back to you and helps you rejuvenate. And so sometimes that means working on sleep. Sometimes that means spending time with friends. I mean, it's different for everybody, but everyone has time for self-care. And my friend Kim Colgrove sent a really neat stat last year, and she works with Pause First Academy, but she said 5 minutes of self-care a day is 30 hours of self-care a year, and we all have time for that.
Ain't that the truth, man? It's so, so true. Even pausing to take a breath in between calls can go a long way. And I know a lot of folks don't feel like we can do that, but just something so small, like you said, that you were not trying to run away from is going to go a long way in making our overall selves feel better so we can continue to help other people, because that's what we do in this line of work, whether you're in the field or in our centers. We're showing up to try to help people. So we gotta take care of ourselves first, for sure.
We do. Yeah. It's just not sustainable. And we know that, and it shows up in sneaky ways. And, people will be like, I haven't slept, but no first responders sleep. And it's like, well, maybe your body is telling you it's too much. And so when you don't listen to your body, the whispers become screams. And before you know it, you're knocked on your behind and you're like, oh, I'm so surprised. I can't believe this happened. But then when you look back and you say, like, but what have I done that has cared for myself in the near term? And it's usually not much.
Yeah, straight up.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, yeah, right? This has been so wonderful. I've learned so much, and I know the folks who are listening have as well. The last thing that I typically ask everybody is, what advice would you give someone who's considering a career specifically for you in the first responder field in general?
Absolutely. So really get acquainted with your first responder agencies. It can go a long way to sit in a call center, to sit in with, your shift briefs, go on ride-alongs, do different things to learn about the work and not make assumptions. And so learning where those strengths are, learning where there may be some deficits from their perspective, and networking really does go a long way. Of course, it does require some schooling, and that can happen anywhere, but even collaborating and following folks on LinkedIn or social media can be also a great way. That's how you and I met, was LinkedIn. And so you just never know what opportunities are there, but you do need to hustle a little bit because you got to get that buy-in. And so you don't want to just show up and say, hey, I have my master's degree in counseling, I'm ready to show up for you guys. You want to invest in the agencies and be creative and innovative and visionary and show up. And when you say you're going to be somewhere. And it's one of the, most rewarding things I can think of doing with my career. And I love it. And I hope more people will start to have this specialized niche, because we certainly need it.
Rachel, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your journey, for all the work you've done for so many people, from, working with survivors to working with our first responders with Beyond the Storm Behavioral Health. I appreciate you, and I know a lot of other folks do.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Awesome. Be right back with you.
All right.
All right, everybody. That was another amazing episode here on Let's Talk Dispatch podcast. Take care of yourself. Like Rachel said, sometimes self-care is just creating environments that you're not trying to run away from. So don't feel like you have to create some amazing self-care routine in order to take care of yourself. Just do something that makes you happy. Do it often. Do it well. And until next time, stay raspy, everybody. Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Dispatch podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're interested in becoming a guest on the show, or maybe even submitting your own story, you can do all that and more at theraspydispatcher.com. Until next time, stay raspy.